Welcome to the final lecture on Chapter 7, Memory. In this lecture, we're going to talk about forgetting. So why do we forget? That's the big question. Now, there's a few ideas of why we forget. The first of which is an encoding failure. So we just lack the ability to encode certain information. So that means it goes from short-term memory into forgetfulness. It doesn't enter long-term memory. And so we don't properly encode the information. So why does this happen? Well, it could be a lack of attention. Maybe you just weren't paying attention. It could be lack of deep processing. So we tend to only encode important information. So maybe at the time that information didn't seem important. Remember how when we talked about encoding, we talked about how we encode important, meaningful things more easily. So you can see how not processing something as important could lead to an encoding failure. We also could forget due to a decay of the memory trace. So long-term physical trace in the nervous system will fade away over time and with disuse. So this is where the idea of if you don't use it, you lose it comes from. In other words, you were properly able to encode a memory and it goes into long-term memory. However, because you don't use it, you're not recalling it and strengthening the connection to that memory, then over time, what your body's going to do is it's going to erase that memory because you didn't use it. So again, you can think of a computer where over time a computer will overwrite information on the hard drive that hasn't been used or isn't being used with more information because it needs the space, and if it's not being used, if it's old information that no one cares about, it's going to override it. So that's the idea of a decay of a memory trace, is that you didn't use your memory, so it became too weak and you lost that connection between long-term memory and working memory. So you're not able to recall it. Now, when we're talking about forgetting, then there's also something called the interference theory. So this is a major theory when talking about why people forget. And for this, then it's saying that information is forgotten because other items in the long-term memory impair your ability to retrieve it. Now, there's two different types of interference. You've got proactive interference, which means past material interferes with the recall of newer material, and retroactive interference. So new information interferes with the ability to recall old information. Okay? Now, this is a little confusing, so we've got a really nice diagram here. So here's an example of proactive interference. So when you're younger, you learn Spanish, okay? And then as you get older, you decide to start learning French. Now, proactive interference is saying that the Spanish will interfere with your recall of French words. So the stuff you learned first is going to prevent you from recalling the new information, okay? So proactive is saying old interacts with new, okay? So that's what the proactive interference is. Now, retroactive interference is kind of the opposite, where you first learn Spanish, again, and then as a teen, you decide to learn French. But then when you go to try to speak Spanish, your French words are interfering with you remembering the Spanish word for something. And so retroactive interference is saying that the new information is preventing you from remembering the old information, okay? So it's old interferes with new, new interferes with old, okay? So proactive, you've got old interferes with new. Retroactive, you have new interferes with old. So Another thing that can happen is motivated forgetting. So this is the idea that we choose to forget certain information. Now, why would we do this? So one idea would be what's called repression, and this may protect us by blocking the recall of an anxiety-arousing memory. So maybe something bad happened and you just don't want to remember it. Now, for me, I tend to repress very embarrassing information, Like when I was younger, my sister convinced me that Santa was down on the first level of the mall, and we were on the second level, and she told me I should stick my head through the railings. So I did. And then I got stuck, and we had to call 911 to get me out. Very embarrassing. And for a while, I repressed this memory because I was very embarrassed, and by remembering it, it induced anxiety. So by forgetting this memory for a while was very good. I actually only remember this now based on what other people have told me about it. I don't remember it actually happening. Another idea of using repression is based on a Freudian concept. So remember, this is the idea of conscious or unconscious processing, right? So this would say that the repression of anxiety-arousing memories is an unconscious process, that our body's doing it naturally to kind of protect us. So that's another idea of what is motivating forgetting. Now, of course, there are some types of forgetting that, we don't want to happen or are due to some sort of brain injury. The most popular, of course, is amnesia. So amnesia is usually due to some sort of brain trauma, whether it's like with HM or Clive that we talked about, how they had different types of amnesia. Then that's either retrograde amnesia, where you have memory loss from events before, or anterograde amnesia, which is memory loss for events after amnesia. So this is a very popular, very talked about form of forgetting. And then one that's very popular among older folks is dementia. So dementia refers to an impaired memory or other cognitive deficits that accompany brain degeneration and interferes with normal functioning. Okay, so dementia is different than Alzheimer's disease. Pretty much Alzheimer's disease is a disease, and one symptom of Alzheimer's is dementia. Okay, so you can have dementia without Alzheimer's, but if you have Alzheimer's, you'll have dementia. With Alzheimer's disease, then we actually see both retrograde and anterograde amnesia. So some pretty severe dementia going on. Alzheimer's disease does tend to start in the temporal lobes, but then it'll spread across the brain. So you can see preclinical. So this is perhaps someone that's been diagnosed with dementia, but not Alzheimer's. And so this area right here is actually like the hippocampus. So we see some deficits here. But then when someone is first diagnosed with Alzheimer's, perhaps a mild case, then we see in the brain that it's really the entire temporal region as well as the hippocampus. And it starts moving into that frontal lobe. And then as we get severe Alzheimer's, then it really spreads all across the brain to pretty much every region. And so that's why Alzheimer's disease is so harmful and so aggressive, because you don't just get loss of memory that's associated with the hippocampus, but memories all across the brain. And that's where you see deficits in both anterograde and retrograde, as well as procedural memories. So remember when we talked about those case studies with long-term memory, then they only had damage to certain areas, and so they still had some type of memory. With Alzheimer's, then as it spreads, you see more and more types of memory being removed and inhibited because of this damage. Now, also when we're talking about forgetting, we need to talk about something called memory distortion. So memory distortion is kind of like where you forget bits and pieces, but then your brain puts together the information you have into a story that makes sense. So in other words, your memory is a constructive or reconstructive process. So you'll piece together those bits of information in a way that intuitively makes sense. And oftentimes, what your brain puts together is very inaccurate. It's not true. And these schemas can really distort our memories. So by seeing something and then forgetting it and then trying to recall it, your brain will put together what information you have, and you could recall something that you didn't actually see. And we see this a lot in some witnesses to crimes where they'll first give an account, and then a few days later, if they're asked about the account again, they'll have forgotten some details, but their brain will fill it in. And that's why you'll see that their account will differ depending on how long they've been away or how long it's been between their different accounts. So memory distortion kind of extends to how we visualize the world. So an example is when university students look at photographs that have a main object within a scene and then try to draw the picture from memory, they'll consistently display the boundary extensions, remembering a scene as more expansive as being a wider angle than it really was. In other words, if I give you a picture and I let you look at it for, say, 30 seconds, and then a minute later I ask you to draw it, they're not going to do as well. So an example is I show you this. So this is the original picture. Okay, so that's the picture that I'm going to show you. And now what I want you to do is try to draw it. Okay, so I showed you a picture, and now draw it. Okay, now let's look at what your picture probably is going to look like based on memory distortion. It's going to look like this. So here, then we have the bear and we have the stairs. But if you notice, what people have done is they consistently displayed the boundary extension. In other words, they're remembering the scene being bigger than it really was. Look at all of these stairs above and below the bear. Look at how far away these stairs go. Whereas if we look at the original image again, all you can see is the bear and like one step. But here, you see all of this. So that's very different, and that's an example of how the memory distorts and how we use what's called a boundary extension. So again, this is very important for eyewitness testimony, as well as how you need to be careful if you're, say, in law enforcement or if you're asking someone to recall something, that you don't do it in a suggestive manner, because suggestive questioning can lead to an inaccurate recall. What that person's brain's going to do is take the suggestions you're giving them and put it together with the pieces of information that they do remember, and they're going to create a brand new scenario in their mind to include these suggestive questions, because their mind's going to want to include that information that you want. And the important thing is that the witness is probably not even aware that they're doing it. Okay, so you're going to give them some suggestive questioning. They're going to change their eyewitness testimony based on that questioning and not even be aware of it. Whereas if you do questioning that doesn't have any suggestive tones in it, then you're more likely to get an accurate testimony. But again, you want to remember that you need that eyewitness testimony pretty quickly after an event to make it most accurate. Now, there are some more details in your textbook about the biology of memory, and we've kind of hand-waved over that. We're not going to talk about it too much, We just want to really focus on what we learned in Chapter 3, that the hippocampus is the main area of memory, and that the hippocampus helps us to consolidate long-term declarative memories. And again, we talked about that when talking with HM. So HM didn't have his hippocampus, and we saw his deficits in declarative memory, but his procedural memory was good. So I probably won't be asking you about any more of the biology of memory other than the hippocampus. And then just a reminder that office hours are by appointment. So in other words, you need to send me an email and we can totally set up a Skype session if you want, or just send me an email with your questions. So let me know if there's anything you want me to go over.